If everyone can be seated there. Okay, this group is panel Science for Summits, and we've got some great folks lined up here. But I'll introduce Maura Longden here, the moderator. She is a former National Park Service climbing ranger and wilderness manager, and has specialized in climbing management for 25 years. She continues to work with Park Service NPS managers and climbing rangers on climbing management planning, best practices of impact, mitigation, and education. Maura?
Thank you. In addition to being the moderator, I guess my more important job is timekeeper today to make sure we get out of here and get some lunch. So we'll shoot for about 12:15. First, I just want to introduce the nature of the panel here. In the mountain regions around the world, scientists are studying resources and changing resource conditions due to both the natural and human-caused processes. So on the Sustainable Science for Sustainable Summits panel, we'll hear from scientists from various disciplines today, and you'll have a chance to ask questions and learn more about their important projects. I have questions for the panel. Given the fact that we're going to do this in a condensed amount of time, I'd like to hold questions from the audience till the end, and then we'll just sort of move things along and get out of here and grab our lunches at that point. At this time, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Just about a minute with your background and projects, the regions you might be working in, and any materials if you have a poster or anything that folks can look at after the session.
My name's Doug Whittaker, and I'm a researcher and planner, works out of Anchorage, Alaska, for a small firm. We're 2 people. We do studies on rivers, so I'm not a climber, but I'm here to talk about how we have some parallels to alpine settings, or some things that are similar, some things that are different. And I'm sort of a social scientist, so I'm sort of representing the citizen science side that might be used in social science, so collecting data about values, attitudes, behaviors, things of that nature.
I'm Mike Loso. I'm a professor at Alaska Pacific, giving a talk tomorrow afternoon about travels in glaciers. I'm actually a glaciologist, and so I teach and do research about sort of background, more so than in Denali in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is twice as big and has about 1/10 of the budget. And so one perspective I bring is manage big problems.
I got into, after failing my assistant alpine guide exam, the Canadian Association of Mountain Guides, and I now work as a consultant for a large organics waste management company called Harvest and remote site toilet systems.
Hi, I'm Ellen Lapham. 4 years ago, I co-founded the American Climber Science Program that brings scientists with significant research needs up in high mountain regions into the regions with volunteer climbers to go and access and gather data over a long term that would give us good indicators of a whole ecosystem. And for instance, in Peru, we've been working for 4 years, and we've gathered data on everything from spectral analysis of the air column at various elevations on peaks to the, and you'll hear that from Carl, the black carbon on the glaciers, to health of climbers and volunteers ascending to very high altitudes, to the effect of grazing in the national parks in Peru on vegetation and things especially now important, water quality and water availability that relate a lot to the, we also have expanded. We had a team in Nepal this spring looking at some subset of similar conditions, and we did the first sea-to-sea transect of Costa Rica from the Pacific to the Atlantic, which you don't think of. I gather, I wasn't on that trip, but I gather it was extremely strenuous going across and gathering the data. So we try to put the science to work in the service of the countries where we're actually
My name is Carl Schmitt. I work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I've been involved with the climate science program that Ellen has been co-directing. I'm, I guess, the scientific advisory chair at this time. The main project that I work on is a project looking at black carbon impacts on the glaciers and how that's potentially accelerating the mass loss. And appropriate to this discussion here, yes, the climate science program is kind of a hybrid citizen science program, and we've gotten some really good data that's gotten some really high-level international attention. So I'd like to be able to share some of that information with you.
Hi, my name is Kenny Wallen. I go to Texas A&M University, where I'm a PhD student in human dimensions of natural resource management. I climb with Carl and Ellen on the climate science program, and specifically I have my poster up there, which is just understanding kind of attitudes and perceptions of climate change among mountaineers. And hopefully over the next year or two, we'll be expanding that kind of to get a better understanding of local stakeholders there in Peru in terms of their perceptions of climate change. In general, I'm a social scientist as well. My doctoral research works with normative behaviors and social influences and stuff like that. So I'm kind of doing a hybrid crossover thing here with the climate science program because I myself, obviously, am a climber, love doing it, and love being able to do science and climate at the same time. So that's what I'm doing. Thanks.
Well, so to begin our discussion of science in mountain environments, we do have three people here who are involved with the American Climber Science Program, ACSP. So my first question is for you. We've heard a little bit about this, but if you go a little more in depth for us, what is the value of citizen science, and how have climbers been involved in these projects?
I'll take that one right off. I've gone down for 3 expeditions so far. I'm actually leaving in a week from now on my 4th expedition. And in the times that I've been down to Peru to do my sampling, I've climbed myself 5 peaks total, something like that, and probably collected myself a total of 40 samples. Through the climber science program, we have samples from 15 different mountains, 3 different years on a lot of those mountains, and 250 different samples collected from those mountains. So basically, well, you know, the techniques that I've developed for this program are not the highest tech techniques. They're really still pretty solid. We lose a little bit in quality, but we gain a lot in coverage. And that's been one of the really big advantages of this program for the research that I'm leading. So that's.
Ellen or Kenny, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think what Carl said is true, but one of the things that we who were not the principal science investigators learned, because we were contributing the logistics, the planning, the fundraising, the public relations, the working with other organizations, including the Alpine Club, which was very supportive of this program in its initial stages, and other people who would have an interest in the kind of work we're doing. I've learned that you just don't go out and do science when you're in the field in remote locations. We've spent, and I know Carl certainly has, spent quite a bit of time refining our field techniques so that he can get the leverage he needs from the volunteer citizen scientist or climber science in the field. So I mean, we even had a discussion about whether you could use an ISAC case. You know, it has to do with contamination of the sample, because we can't use metals when we're doing water sampling, because that will affect the assay of the water that takes place in the lab, because you're introducing a metal into the water. But can we use metal for snow? I mean, we have these very fine discussions about techniques in the field, but I think the thing is that we're doing 2 things I think are great. One is we're really leveraging science in places where the science actually, getting that knowledge on the ground can really make a substantial difference. And I think Peru is a good case in point for this. So that's one. And the other is a lot of us are coming back as advocates for not just science in the field, but also for what we're observing. As was pointed out, talking about Karsten's pyramid, we're interacting with a community of people in Peru. We're not just helicoptering in and helicoptering out. We're there for months at a time, and so we're developing relationships with the science community there, with students. We have an active with farmers, and guides. So as I say, there's an ecosystem of community that's around the science program now. It's not just pure science.
Can you do peer caliber science with volunteers?
Yes.
Peer review caliber?
Yes.
Yep.
The climate science program has been pretty much all volunteer up to now. So those of us working on it, we have our full-time jobs in addition. So it's taken a little while, but I have a peer-reviewed or a journal article that I'm about to submit. I hope to actually have it submitted before today. That's going to be one of my higher level journal publications in my career. It's going to a really good journal, and I've gotten really, really good feedback from it when I've passed it out to some experts in the field. So I think it should go through peer review, hopefully without too much difficulty, but yes, you definitely can. You know, you have to be really good about making sure your techniques are high quality, reproducible, and simple, especially if it's, you know, if you're just sending people off to do these measurements. It has to be something that people can wrap their minds around, wrap their hands around, and do it and feel like they're doing things comfortably. But yeah, if the techniques are good and simple and it's easy for people to do, yeah, I think you can.
Yeah, and given that the climate science program is framed as a citizen science program, the people on the program are willing to learn and able to learn the techniques that we need to use to collect data, whether it's, you know, from a natural scientist perspective or from a social science perspective. So that's one of the benefits of framing it as a citizen science program, is that the people, the volunteers on the program, are more than willing and obviously capable of collecting the data that we need to get.
I'm going to see if we can fit in one question from the audience regarding citizen science. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask the panel? We'll come back to that at the end then. I'm going to move into a different area here. In the mountain regions around the world, impacts from recreational use, development to support tourism, and regional expansion due to population increase are affecting resources and character to varying degrees. According to some social scientists, changing human behaviors is the key to resolving many conservation problems. So my next question is for the audience. It's time to wake up. With a show of hands now, how many of you assume that once people know that their behaviors are actually negatively impacting the environment, they'll stop? How many assume that? If you know that your behavior is negatively impacting the environment, you'll stop that behavior. A couple of folks? How many people don't assume that at all? All right, let's ask the social scientists. So panelists, can you give us an example of how changing attitudes have led to a change in the behavior that have lessened impact to a mountain environment, improved the visitor experience, or created safer climbing conditions? Doug, you want to take that one?
Well, sure. And so I'm not going to talk about mountains so much, because I don't have much data about that. But obviously, human waste management in river settings predated some of the stuff you guys are doing on mountains. And people have been packing out their waste on river trips for a couple of decades now in some places, and certainly for a decade in others. And it was something that it didn't come with just education, and it actually comes in large part with regulation first, behavior to follow. Then it gets subsumed into their attitudes and values. So attitudes follow the behavior rather than the other way around. That's something that social scientists talk about a lot. And sometimes that occurs. It can come from both directions. But with regard to science about that, one of the interesting things, so as social scientists, the things we're studying are people's ideas in their heads or their behaviors. So we can ask people on these trips to tell us about the stuff they did or stuff that they're thinking about. And we have to ask them, either when they get back or before they go, in some cases, but sometimes we need to find out what they're doing actually out there, and that's why the study the other day from the Everest and K2, from the guy from Sweden, I'm sorry, I forget his name, is incredible, but he sent a team up there to do that. And sometimes we just have to ask the guys to remember their trip. And so, are they good at that, doing that? It goes back to the stuff Carl was saying. It's got to be simple, and it's got to be easy for them to do, and it can't take away from their other activities, which are more important to them, like getting to the summit or whatnot. So, if you're asking them to collect observation data or something on their trips, it better be easy to do. On rivers, the biggest technological fix we found was getting this is to get river rangers to record stuff, was getting it into a small enough sized notebook, Write in the Rain notebook that fit in their chest pocket so they would take it out when they saw the activity. And it's a small thing like that. Now with climbing, you guys got no fingers. I don't know how you're gonna write, but anyway, you got some interesting challenges, I think.
Yeah, I agree with what Doug's saying. A lot of times people will assume that attitudes do equate to behavior, but in a large part of the social sciences, that's kind of debated. And as Doug said, behaviors tend to change attitudes more than the other way around. But it's interesting, your question, because in a lot of instances, it's not just a cognitive fix of attitudes and behaviors, but as Doug pointed out, like a technological fix, or even something as simple as a structural fix like signs or any sort of other objects, targets, something that the National Park Service, say for instance, can put on trails or somewhere for people to see and utilize, where it becomes sort of an object where they kind of like, okay, that's what I need to do, so I'm going to do that. So it's not necessarily changing attitudes as much as kind of understanding attitudes, and as Doug pointed out, values and belief systems as well, because it's just really just a big complex of everything working together within the context, because it's not going to be the same in every environment. So it's not going to be the same with river systems and waste management as it is with mountains and waste management. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples. I mean, the trail signs and stuff like that are some of the better examples of it working to impact attitudes and actual behaviors, but then also there are instances of those signs actually doing the complete opposite, where you tell people to stay on the trail with the signs and they tend to go off the trail because of the signs. So it's interesting. It's not to get into too much, but it's an interesting debate within the social sciences and an interesting discussion to have.
I'll have a crack at that. The question went to everyone out there about human behavior, and if we know that we're damaging the environment. Is that the particular wording? Is it going to change our behavior? What do we do that doesn't damage the wilderness places we're going to? Is there anything we do that contributes to the ecosystem connectivity of the wilderness areas we're going to? Let's bring it to an example. I live in Vancouver. I'm going to go climbing in Squamish. Let's say I have the average of everything, so I have an average car. I'm going to drive up there, and I'm going to burn fossil fuels on the way, contributing to climate change, eventually modifying that ecosystem, and modifying it all the time. We're in a state of rapid climate change, as one example. Or I'm going to go hike on some trails, and I'm not contributing to the growth of plants or much connectivity. If anything, I'm attempting to leave no trace. But really, am I having an impact? Absolutely, always. So it seems like I would agree with most people's vote on that one, that we're not that reliable in not damaging ecosystems, because just about everything we do has a negative impact, and that's the state of our culture. That's the state of humans versus environment as like a very fundamental challenge for mostly our own society, ultimately. And flux and change happens in the natural world over millions, thousands, hundreds of years, minutes, hours. And ultimately, whether our society lasts to be hundreds of years or not. But should we ever actually find out what it means to be sustainable, we would be thinking, how are we contributing to the connectivity in this place? And I don't know. I can't think of an example about how I would go and do that. All I try and do is minimize my impact and everything. But it's a different paradigm. It's a different perspective.
Well, are humans part of the ecosystem or not is one of those, if we're going into real deep philosophy here, but sometimes people will say, well, we're part of the ecosystem. Some of our impacts are okay. That's part of what the ecosystem is about, and it's dynamic. And some people would say, and nature doesn't care. It doesn't care that we've let dandelions grow everywhere. The dandelions like it just fine. The things they're replacing don't. And it's a value judgment as the so-called stewards of the planet. It's a value judgment about whether or not we think this new state is worse or better than the other one. I'm not saying I hold that. I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate. But anyway, those are some alternate viewpoints there.
Ben?
There was some paper that was published by some researchers from Colorado State that looked at changing behavior in terms of Lego trace. It wasn't a mountaineering sample, but it was from Rocky Mountain National Park. It looked at attitudes, perceptions, self-described knowledge of Lego trace, and perceived difficulty. And what they found was that if people understood why the recommendations were effective in protecting the environment, they were more likely to practice those. It was more of a driver of the attitude. It was more important than perceptions of difficulty, and it was more important than self-described knowledge. So the notion of having people understand the nature of the impact they're creating and why it's an issue, at least in this sample, was more of a driver of behavior in the future.
So correlation or causation there is, I guess, my question.
That's what
I think they go together, no doubt. So I think that's good, but I don't know which one caused it, and I think that's the endless debate in our
Yeah.
field.
Well, I think I'm familiar with that paper. I think that's Vasky and Manfredo because they have the human dimensions of wildlife up there. And so they do, sorry, I'm going to get academic on everybody, but they do structural equation modeling with a lot of other stuff, so it's more like a causation pathway with stuff. But yeah, it is still within the sciences, within the social sciences, it is the debate. It's the chicken or the egg. But I like how they frame that because it really is. If you get people to understand and explain more about what's going on and why it needs to be done, it legitimizes the behavior and the need for the behavior or whatever it is that we're trying to do. So I think a lot of stuff within what we're talking about, we've talked about like the participatory consensus planning and stuff like that. It is kind of legitimizing that process for the decision making, for the implementation of these regulations and enforcing these regulations. So getting more people involved, understanding the values and beliefs and attitudes of everybody to, again, legitimize it and increase the understanding of why it needs to be done or why it doesn't need to be done is of vast importance, I think.
Let's take one more question now, and then we'll have more at the end of the session. Over here in the back.
So, from a marketing perspective, I'm always looking at the demographic, psychographic aspects of any of this. And I feel like I look around the room, and there are fairly few millennials here in this room. So, and when we're looking even at the club, at the Maura Mountain Club, working with our conservation projects, things like that, we're having to find where we market and try to get volunteers and things to change behaviors. From each of your perspectives, where are you starting to look at your demographics instead of a kind of broader range, specifically in each of your work, and what maybe has and hasn't worked when dealing with millennials? Because they need a little bit more, I find, give me something. I'm going to give you, you give me. Where have you found that in each of your works?
Well, as a social scientist, I do survey research, so I ask them questions and usually they answer, but they often lie. So I have to be careful what their answer is. And I think that with the new breed of people, so we've changed our survey research techniques dramatically in the last 2 decades. We used to do only mail surveys or on-site surveys. then we switched for a little while to phone surveys. That's completely unworkable anymore at getting a random sample. And we're back out in the field. I think it's a good thing that to talk to people in the field is the best way to find out what's going on. It's right when things are happening. But you do have to talk to them differently. And I don't want to get into disparaging comments or whatever, but attention spans are lower for the old people too. Everybody's attention span is gone. If we could talk to them by texting, we might get more information. But anyway, there's lots of issues like that come up, and new generations react in different ways. And if you don't adjust, you won't learn stuff. And they're coming up with new attitudes, often very pro-environment attitudes, until it's interfering with some other goal that they have, and that's the other big driver of, when does an attitude change a behavior if there's nothing else getting in the way? So.
Thank you. We'll come back to more questions about the social science aspects here, but I'm going to move on to a different topic. So let's talk for a moment about some of the challenges of conducting science and applying it to the protection of resources and management of visitor use. Is there a disconnect between scientists and land managers, and how can they communicate more effectively?
Yeah, okay, I'll
The
take a
answer
step
is
back.
yes.
I think the answer is
The answer
yes.
is no.
There is. And I think there's a lot of ways to go after that disconnect, but I think one of them is really, it's simple. It amounts to getting, I'm not going to say scientists, but people who have some knowledge about the resource and the impacts of behavior on the resource. So that can be local folks, climbers, guides, scientists, whoever it is that has some knowledge to share, getting them in the same room with the decision makers. And I think that conversation is surprisingly not difficult. It's surprisingly rare that occurs. And we heard some talks today this morning about the importance of that. And so, I just want to echo that. The last point that Paul made in his 5 lessons learned from Denali was that the implementers need to talk with the planners. And one of the things I've seen, particularly with the Park Service in Alaska, is that, at least my perception is, there's been sort of a professionalization of planning, meaning there's people whose job is, and even more than that, professionalization of public process. There's people who are hired to be planners or to conduct public meetings. It's their job. We've sort of specialized to the point where it's their job to go and talk to the public, to the scientists, to the climbers, to the guides. But they're not oftentimes the decision makers. And so there's a process where, with the land management, information and maybe writes it down in a really well-written document. And in the rent, I think that's unfortunate. That the sort of public dialogue resides within a position or a particular job description. I think it's really important that all of the persons within the land management agency are accessible to the public, to the scientists, to the climbers, the guides, and I think all of us have a responsibility, not just the land management agencies, to help make sure that those waste management decision that he was going to make, and I think just more communication at an informal level or outside of the venues of the planners is important.
I'm glad you said that. I'm going to put my ranger hat on now. Because if we talk about a planning process where we've got requirements and we've got science that's necessary for the bigger decisions and to defend our plans, but quite frankly, as a land manager and as a ranger, I was responsible, and my staff was responsible for making decisions each and every day. If we anticipated unacceptable impacts occurring, or they were occurring. And tell me, from your perspective, does the science need to be done first before I make that decision?
realistic to always have the science, but I think to the extent that the science is there, we all have an obligation to make sure it's, that everyone's aware of it. But I think we have to make decisions in the absence of the best information because we rarely have it. But I do think it's imperative that what science is available is in the process.
I mean, we have two entities, each set up on a different fundamental premise. They have different objectives entirely. You know, if you set up your science to implement policy, you're just a collection of information. Same thing, the management is not whatever set of priorities are given to you. And that either as a professional, the overlapping positive, intertwining objectives and accountable obstacles, you never get to do this type of thing. So it seems like fundamentally it's a communication problem. And very few people have exceptional communication skills. I mean, if anyone says they don't have disputes with their, significant other, they would be an expert and probably lying. And so it seems like if we were to try and get those to talk better, we might look at figuring out who is best at communicating and use that as a vehicle to work interdisciplinary. And it doesn't have to be one field or one group to another. Just and it sounds like those are already happening. If those professional facilitators are there in these meetings, I mean, that sounds like a good step to replicate.
Let me throw in a third player in this dialogue, though, and that's the public. And I can speak from working on the management plan for the Tahoe Basin, but it was such a horrible experience that I would rather talk about Peru, which is more recent and I'm more hopeful about. Last year, the Peruvian Park Service in Juarez and other entities sponsored a glacier conference in Juarez, which is a city of 100,000 at the foot of the Cordillera Blanca in northern Peru, and invited the public to come in and learn about their glaciers. And the idea was to start educating and starting the dialogue with farmers, city dwellers, visitors, tourists, scientists, NGOs. It was a pretty mixed audience about the state of the glaciers in that part of Peru. And the reason why it's important is that not only are they a major source of water to a desert country, but they're losing glacial mass at a huge rate. Plus, they've got these GLOFs, as they're called, glacier lake outburst floods, that in the past have wiped out whole cities, and very suddenly so. Nepal has a lot of the same problems. So a lot of what the value of this dialogue was, which is now going to start informing, going backwards and informing the planning in the park and some of the politics in the region, is that now the farmers are aware of a lot of the science that is going on and they've gotten interested. They don't want GLOFs, they want to know something more about their water supply. They're actually hungry for knowledge. And these are not necessarily people with college degrees. These are people who are very closely tied to the landscape they live in. So we're finding that there's a desire for science, but there's also now a desire on their part to say, I have this knowledge, I want to know more, I want the scientists to tell us more. And they can use that as a tool in the political process, in the planning process. So no, can't say that's true here in the US, but that may also show a path in other parts of the world where you've got these horrible water resource issues that are coming up suddenly. And that's where science can make a big difference in how, in the case of Peru, it gets through this big transition.
One thought, is the level of the question and the level of the problem. If it's something like the poo melting out of the glaciers, that's obviously very imminent. If it's something like the project that I'm leading, which is the water supply, essentially looking at the impacts of pollution on the glaciers and which is affecting the long-term water supply, the big issues are potentially 10, 20, 30 years down the road. That's when the glacier-fed rivers are going to start going dry, something like that, potentially a little faster, a little slower, depending on what's going on. There's several potential in the case of this project. The first question is to figure out if there's a problem. We have the luxury, potentially the luxury of time and being able to figure out that problem, and the fact that it's not affecting us right now immediately, so we can figure out if there is a problem and then figure out how to address the problem. And in some cases, obviously, time is really critical. In some cases, they don't necessarily think, the local people, managers may not necessarily think that there's a problem or think that there's anything that they can do about it. And that's where the science first technique really is pretty important. But the action first, obviously, don't put your who there, is obviously a very important, and depending on the problem. So I think there's very different levels there to the different answers to the question.
The sweep of the science that we're talking about is so,
yes.
The scales are at such huge differences.
Yes.
The stuff you were talking about, I'm an applied scientist trying to deal with very specific visitor impact managements in very specific places. And we design our science directly to answer a question a planner wants to know. A relationship between use and an impact, or a relationship between a regulation and an impact, something like that. And I've worked in some big parks, kind of like Paul's Denali. I've worked in Grand Canyon and Yosemite, sometimes under threat of lawsuit or a lawsuit guiding the work, where we had lots of money and we could do lots of research and inform lots of questions. And then I've worked in places where there's no money, and it's kind of like what you got out at Wrangles. And what are you going to do then? And one of the answers is, I have no science, therefore I can't make a decision. And I think that's the danger zone for what I do, is that they say, oh, we don't have any information, we haven't monitored, I can't even contemplate something here. And I think that because a lot of the things we do are cumulative impacts, or impacts that once they're bad, it's hard to turn back the clock, you got to be careful about that. So I think sometimes you have to use professional judgment, think ahead. The places that did that, in some ways, did pretty well, and they sometimes did it because some scientist was warning them. Kind of like the early climate change scientists were warning all of us. We still haven't even listened, but anyway.
Thank you. How about some questions from the audience?
Do any of you have an example of where local peoples were involved in the science, where you gave them directions, they worked with you, and then you left and they continued a project? Of any? Where, for example, some of the folks in this room might be interested in that, because you can't obviously live in these places all the time, but they could continue something with far-off guidance.
There's,
Yeah.
who wants to go first?
Well, you and I have worked on a project.
Oh, yes.
So,
I guess I'd call myself, I'm thinking more of something that, yeah, definitely. You're Canadian and Alaskan, so.
true.
Yeah. But I know nothing about, and you're giving me full guidance, yeah.
Are you presenting on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't spoil it.
No, well, you could mention it, yeah.
Well, so a lot of my PhD research was on human waste management systems, actual toilet systems to manage human waste, waterless remote sites. And some of there was a company called Ecosphere, and now it's Sanisphere, who is presenting tomorrow. And they have a urine diverting vermicomposting toilet. And so I investigated that and compared it to North American systems. I'm presenting that research, but one of the processes that came out of that was the benefits of diverting urine away from fecal matter and managing the two streams separately. Ultimately, physiologically, we source separate ourselves. And so some of the other waste management practices have built into them a source separation, such as the Clean Mountain cans that Roger runs. So there is a source of this relatively pure fecal matter that you guys take it to a wastewater treatment plant, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of management of that material. As it comes out of the can, it goes into a barrel or a holding tank, and it goes into a septic truck, and it gets dumped at the wastewater treatment plant. And there's even questions about, is the wastewater treatment plant the best thing in a lot of these smaller northern communities? So one of the projects that Roger and I got mutually interested in was vermicomposting source separated human waste out of the CMC cans. And we've gone back and forth since the last conference. You know, an email or two a month, lab analyses, Roger's doing all the work and sending the samples, and I'm helping. And it was effective, I think, really quite effective. But it was a unique pairing with similar interests. So it seems like to make that work in other areas, there still seems like there needs to be that body. Some body that finds, has a database of scientists and has a database of people needing technical expertise and melds the two together and manages outcomes and expectations.
Yeah, and I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a climber, so pretty much my whole life helping people climb, and dealing with this waste stuff has been like an eye-opener.
So does anybody know of a body that, speaking of it, some comes to mind having spoken about it before, but there must be some bodies out there that join citizen groups to scientists.
Yeah, well, so water quality monitoring is a pretty big deal for volunteers. Like Trout Unlimited has people collecting macroinvertebrates and stuff in the streams and shipping them off or doing their own counts, things like that. And I think sometimes those get on automatic pilot and people do them for forever, even after the scientists have long lost interest.
Bird counts.
Bird counts, yeah, the Christmas bird count, that's one. So I think there are examples like that.
There's the Mountain Institute has their Sherpa Science Plan where they're doing program where the Sherpas are doing in Nepal doing water quality sampling. I'm working with a group that they were doing glacier measurements in the Cordillera Blanca for 20 years. They've been doing this, and they just ran out of funding. And I'm actually picking up the funding because they're doing now doing black carbon measurements. So we're getting black carbon measurements year round, which until now we've just had data from the dry season. I've got that going there. I'm trying to get university groups, students in various different places. I've got some people interested in Cusco, some people in La Paz, Bolivia, who are going to be doing stuff like that. And yeah, that's scientists, not necessarily citizen science, but the guy doing the glacier measurements in Cordillera Blanca, he's getting a little pay for it, but yeah, he's been doing it for 20 years, he and his family. So I think there's programs like that that can exist, and especially in lower financial areas, it can be pretty inexpensive to get good quality measurements. If it's water quality or what I'm doing with the snow samples. So.
Did you have a question back here? You raised your hand a few times.
Maybe not so much a question as an encouragement. The projects I'm running, we have also been using kind of volunteers to do research that haven't been scientists at all. And as a matter of fact, actually the group we put together for Everest came from different subjects, including some kind of natural sciences stuff. So we had to train them in qualitative methods and so on. And we have also worked with climbers to collect qualitative data higher up because it's kind of inaccessible and so on. I think the benefit of it, and that's what I would like to encourage you, is that, using that, use the benefits of kind of crowdsourcing. So we could kind of collect more data on a broader set in more kind of settings, and through that gain insights which might influence policymakers, managers, or whatever. So it's more of an encouragement than a comment rather than a question.
Roger, how are we doing on time? We have some more questions.
Yeah, let's go with some more questions. This is
Okay,
good stuff.
good, yeah.
I think another good example of what you were talking about is the raptor monitor in this country. A lot of that was developed by scientists, and then local communities have just taken it over. Been monitored for decades, just with volunteers. I think it ties back to the question you asked at the beginning: is what drives what, and having the community monitor raptors and understand behavior patterns of raptors then allows them to understand why it's important to comply with certain things and comply with
programs come to mind. Somebody else back here? Yes, sir.
Just to echo what Marcus said about encouragement. As an environmental professional, as somebody who actually sort of took that to work in the outdoors, in the wilderness areas, I see a lot of prospective expeditioners coming to us with, which I disparagingly refer to as pseudoscience, and it uses projects to raise the funding to come down. Obviously, where we operate, it's very expensive to get there. So people actually want to be able to sell their project. But really, that is actually what they want to do, is have an adventure and back that up or justify it with some science. It gets a bit frustrating to see that. When you look around this room, how much knowledge there is. There's people here who are serious environmental professionals who actually, obviously are serious outdoors people as well. And I think that actually having a body that can actually coordinate this in some way, or can actually just to represent it. I think in mountain areas, it would be like really significant. There is an organisation like that that works in the polar areas. I think it's called APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And these are people who actually maybe they're studying something, or they want to be affiliated, maybe it could be a social scientist, a social science, or a physical science. And they actually work on other projects. So it actually has an actual outcome. Because I think, we've all seen it. You can just go on the internet and you'll see many examples of expeditions that are sort of pushing some kind of science. And it isn't at all. And I think it's important for us to be honest about that. Often we justify going to these places because we want to go there. And we try and justify it by coming up with some reason. With all the energy and the enthusiasm, it would be very good to get mentorship and to get direction and leadership, so you do get something concrete out of it at the end of the day.
Great comment. Thank you.
Couple of things in response to that. I totally agree with that. So when we ask for citizen scientists, we still imagine that there's a PI, a principal investigator somewhere else directing that science. The thing you're talking about is where the expedition is formed around their own scientific ideas, and they're the PI. And whether that's good or bad, I think it's often what you say is, it's pseudoscience. It may not be real, so be careful about that. But the other thing that reminds me of with you, because you're one of those unique operators that's really interested in pro-environment behaviors, the guides that do return trips, they may be their best citizen scientists yet, and we could possibly, meaning agencies or the commons or whatever, could make them do that work as a privilege for being able to guide there. And so I think there's some opportunity there over the long haul that agencies are not taking advantage of. Having said that, in Grand Canyon, we tried to get the Grand Canyon guides to do stuff for us, and we couldn't make them do it. But in Grand Canyon, the guides kind of run the park, so in some ways that's why. But again, you've got to make sure that the thing you're asking them to do is something they can do and still get their other stuff done. And so that's the key there.
That kind of gets into the technicalities in terms of permitting.
Right.
One quick comment, and I hate to make the sales pitch here, but kind of along those lines, I'm starting up a little program to try to do monitoring along all of the Andes to get black carbon measurements along all the Andes with the techniques that I developed with the ACSP. And so it's nice and easy techniques. Getting people who are going down climbing to the Andes, I'll send you the gear, show you how to use it, get it back at the end, and guides potentially in different areas could be an incredible resource for something like that. This is something that I've talked to Ellen and Kenny about different aspects of the project that we can actually work into it to get the most bang for the buck as far as on the social side, understanding people's motivations, why they're going where and stuff like that, and on the scientific side, so we can get one of the big problems is there pretty much hasn't been any look at black carbon in all of South America on the glaciers, except for the ACSP measurements. So I'm working with an international community down in South America, and we're trying to expand that. And this is one of the ideas that we had, just to get citizen scientists and potentially guides and stuff, and people like that to potentially help us out with this type of project. So, sorry for the pitch.
Great. Well, obviously we're running into lunchtime here. I encourage you to continue these conversations and questions for our panelists out at lunch and in the hallways and days to come. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take a lunch. lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock. And,